Only after the end of the war, the general circles learned something about the emergence of a plan which, instead of the pre-existing, issued by the OK Directive on the deployment of GEL B of October 1939, was adopted as the basis of our offensive in the West. The plan, as a result of the implementation of which in the West was achieved such a rapid and decisive success against the Anglo-French army, as well as the armed forces of Belgium and Holland. The origin of the new plan was probably first reported by the English war writer Littlegarth, who connected it with my name on the basis of statements by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, my commander, and General Blumentritt, our chief of operations at the time. In consequence of this, I think it right to attempt now, as a principal participant, on the basis of the data at my disposal, to reconstruct a picture of the origin of this operational plan, which was destined to play some part. Indeed, the thoughts which formed the basis of this plan are mine. I myself drafted those aides-de-camp which were sent by the Army Group headquarters to the Oak. We wanted to achieve the adoption of an offensive plan that would meet our views, and one was able to ensure decisive success in the West. Finally, in February 1940, already after my departure from the post of Chief of Staff of Army Group A, I had the opportunity during a conversation with Hitler to report to him about those plans, the adoption of which the Army Group headquarters so long sought in. A few days later, the OK issued a new offensive directive, which was based on our plans and proposals. I wish, however, to state clearly that my commander, Colonel General von Rundstedt, as well as my assistants Blumentritt and Tresco, always agreed with my proposals, and that von Rundstedt signed them and defended them in our appeals to the OK. For the officer studying the history of the war, and for the historian, it would seem useful to study the history of this struggle for an operational plan in all its details. But I do not wish to make it difficult for the reader to recount all our appeals to the OK, and which would be inevitable, to repeat the events already described. These appeals contain, in addition, arguments and demands, which are of course no longer of interest today, since they belonged to a certain period and indications of what could be achieved at that time. For those who wish to study the prehistory of the offensive in the West in more detail, the book is supplemented by the directives of the OKE, as well as letters from the Army Group headquarters to the OK. I shall therefore confine myself to first outlining the main points underlying the OK directives. I will then explain the reasons why I find the strategic vision of the OK unsatisfactory. I will then outline the essential points on which the strategic concept advocated by Army Group headquarters was based, comparing it with the operational plan of the OK. Finally, I will briefly describe how, after a long and futile struggle, it was still possible to achieve that, certainly on Hitler's instructions. The original operational plan was modified in the spirit of the provisions advocated by Army Group headquarters. The operational plan of the First, I want to try to characterize, on the basis of the directives of the OK, which I have in my possession, the basic strategic idea of the OK for the planned offensive. It consisted of the following. In accordance with Hitler's instructions of October 9, OK planned to strike reinforced right flank of the German army in the direction of Holland and northern Belgium, and to break the Anglo-French forces in Belgium together with the Belgian and Dutch armies. Consequently, this strong flank grouping had the task of achieving decisive success. It was created as part of Army Group H and Army Group B, and deployed in the lower reaches of the Rhine and northern. Army Group B consisted of 3 armies. In total, the grouping of the northern flank included 30 infantry divisions and most of the mobile formations. Thus, almost half of the total 102 divisions on the Western Front was concentrated here. While the Army Group had the task of taking Holland out of the war, the 3 armies of Army Group B were to carry out an offensive north and south of Liège and further through northern Belgium. In this case, the tank formations had the task of playing a decisive role in breaking through the enemy positions on a wide front. On October 29, this first directive, issued on October 19, was modified in the direction that Holland was to be left behind first. It is possible that this was done at the request of the OK. So my Group B was now to strike with 2 armies in the first echelon and 2 armies in the second echelon on either side of Liège. Later, however, Holland was again included in the war zone, with the task of taking it out of the war falling to the 18th Army. The operation of Army Group B, aiming to achieve a decisive success, was to be covered on the southern flank of Army Group A. This army group of 2 armies, numbering 22 divisions, was to strike through southern Belgium and Luxembourg. It was deployed in the southern Eifel and Gunsruck. 12th Army, following the ledge to the left, was, so to speak, to accompany the offensive of Army Group B, so that in its further advance to ensure its flank from enemy action. 16th Army, after the march through Luxembourg, had to turn south to provide a deep flank of the entire operation, taking the defence, which was mainly immediately north of the western flank of the Maginot Line between the Sayre and the Meuse, east of Sedan. The task of Army Group Z, consisting of 2 armies and 18 infantry divisions, was to guard the western wall from the Luxembourgian to the Swiss border. There were still 17 infantry divisions and 2 mobile divisions in the reserve of the Oak. The purpose of this operation, according to paragraph 1 of the Deployment Directive of October 19, formulated in the section General Intentions, was the defeat, if possible, the large forces of the French army and its allies, and at the same time capture as much space as possible in the territory of Holland, Belgium and northern France as a bridgehead for the successful conduct of air and naval warfare with England, and as a wide band of support for the Ruhr area. In paragraph 2 of this directive defined as the immediate task of the offensive, which was to be led by the commander of the ground forces for both groups of armies, by constraining the Dutch army to defeat the largest possible part of the Belgian army in the area of border fortifications and rapid concentration of large, especially mobile, formations to create prerequisites for non-stop continuation of the offensive by a large grouping of the northern flank, and for the rapid seizure of the sea coast of Belgium. In connection with the already mentioned change in the directive, which was made on October 29, the OK expanded the task for Army Group B, changing the wording of the general intentions as follows: if possible, large forces of the French army to take the battle on the territory of northern France and Belgium and defeat them, thus creating more favourable prerequisites for the continuation of the war on land and in the air against England and France. In the paragraph grouping of forces and tasks, OK put before Army Group B the following goal: to destroy the combined forces of the Allies in the area north of the Somme and go to the coast of the English Channel. Army Group A received the former task of defensive nature. To cover the actions of Army Group B, however, it was slightly expanded. 12th Army, operating on the right flank, was now to quickly force the Meuse in the area of Fiume and south of it, and strike through the fortified French border zone in the general direction of Lyon. The operational plan underlying both directives can probably best be explained in the following way. A powerful right fist was to smash the Anglo-French army forces, which, according to our information, were in Belgium, while a weak left arm was to cover this strike. The aim of the operation with regard to territorial objectives was to reach the Channel coast. What was to happen after this first strike could not be known from the directive. Objections. The first reaction to the operational plan set forth in both directives arose in me not consciously, but rather intuitively. The operational intentions of the OK resembled in basic features the famous Schlieffen Plan of 1914. I found it rather depressing that our generation could think of nothing else but to repeat an old recipe, even if it came from a man like Schlieffen. What could come of pulling out of the closet a military plan which the enemy had already once gone over with us, and for the repetition of which he must be prepared? For any military expert must have imagined that the Germans were now unwilling and unable to strike at the Maginot Line, to an even greater extent than they had done in 1914 at the fortified area of Verdun-Tulle-Thouarul. In this first, rather gut reaction, it is true that I was unfair to the OK. Firstly, because the plan came from Hitler, and secondly, because it was not at all a question of repeating the Schlieffen Plan. The widespread belief that the two plans coincided is true in only 2 respects. First, in 1939, as in 1914, the main blow was delivered by the northern flank. Second, in both cases it was delivered through Belgium. In other respects, however, the plans of 1914 and 1939 were quite different. First of all, the situation was completely different. In 1914, it was still possible, as Schlieffen did, to count on operational surprise, if not to the full extent that applies in general to the strike through Belgium, then still with regard to the concentration of the main forces of the German army on the extreme northern flank. In 1939, these intentions of Hitler could not be unknown to the enemy. Further, in 1914 it was possible, like Schlieffen, to hope that the French would kindly do us a favour by first launching an offensive on Lorraine. In 1939, however, such a favour of the enemy was nothing to expect. He will obviously throw in advance to meet our advancing troops, striking through Belgium, and according to another plan and through Holland, large forces with which we, unlike in 1914, will have to fight frontal battles. Instead of premature French initiative in the centre of the front could be a strong counterattack on the southern flank of our main forces advancing through Belgium. Therefore, the Schlieffen plan could not simply be repeated. In addition, it became clear to me that neither the OK nor Hitler thought of taking as a model the Schlieffen plan in all the grandeur of its conception. Schlieffen made his plan in the expectation of a complete and final defeat of the entire French army. He wanted, so to speak, to stretch out a long arm and embrace the enemy from the north, thus clearing all of northern France in order to strike west of Paris to press, in the end, the entire French army to the line Metz-Vosges, Swiss border and force it to surrender. In doing so, he took into account the risk of counter-strikes in Alsace at the beginning of the offensive, as well as the fact that the enemy's offensive in Lorraine in turn will help the Germans to win in their large operation to cover the French army decisive success. In the operational plan of 1939, however, does not contain a plan for the complete defeat of the enemy. The explicit goal of the entire operation is a private victory over the Allied forces in northern Belgium. At the same time, the goal is to win space, seize the Channel coast, and thereby obtain a bridgehead for the further deployment of military operations. It could be that Colonel General von Brauchitsch and his chief of staff, in drawing up directives for the operation, remembered the words of Moltke, written by him in the introduction to the works of the General Staff on the War of 1870-1871. No operational plan can determine with certainty the course of an operation, except for the first encounter with the main forces of the enemy. Only a profane man can assume that the course of an operation consistently reflects the original plan, adopted in advance, thought out in every detail, and carried through to completion. If this provision was the basis of the plans of the OK, the latter evidently decided that even after achieving the goal of the operation, a private victory on the northern flank, in Belgium and access to the Channel coast, it could be determined whether and in what direction it would continue. But what I heard on receipt of the directive on the offensive in Zossen gave me reason to believe that the OK did not believe that there was a possibility of a complete victory in the French theatre of operations. At any rate, it considered it extremely doubtful. Subsequently, this impression was further reinforced in our headquarters during frequent visits to it by the commander of the land forces and the chief of the general staff. Repeated remarks of the Army Group headquarters that a complete victory was possible, the OK never really considered. I also think that Hitler did not believe at that time in the possibility of taking France out of the war in this operation. Rather, he recalled primarily the fact that we in 1914, due to the failure of our offensive, did not even have the base necessary to wage submarine warfare against England. To obtain such a base, that is, to gain possession of the Channel coast, he therefore paid so much attention. Now it was quite clear that it is impossible during one operation, as envisioned by the plan Schlieffen, to achieve a complete defeat of France. The prerequisites for this in connection with the above-described changed situation no longer existed. If, however, it was intended, after a private victory, to which the OK sought to develop the offensive further with the prospect of taking France out of the war, then the first operation should have been organized with this ultimate goal in mind. It should have pursued the goal of defeating the northern flank of the enemy, in order to obtain, as a result of this, a decisive superiority for the second strike, which was to ensure the defeat of the remaining forces of the Western powers in France. On the other hand, this operation was to create for this second strike favorable operational environment. The fulfillment of both of these conditions for the obviously planned second strike, which was to bring the final victory, in my opinion, in the plan of the first operation was not provided for. Strike group of German troops, Army Group B with its 43 divisions, the invasion of Belgium would have met with 20 Belgian, and if the war would be drawn into the war in Holland, then also with 10 Dutch divisions, even though these forces would be inferior to the German forces in their fighting qualities, but they could oppose them with powerful fortifications, as well as natural obstacles that would create favorable opportunities for resistance. In a few days, however, these enemy forces would be aided by British and French troops already standing ready in case of a German invasion of Belgium at the Franco-Belgian border. Thus, the German forces advancing on the flank could not get the opportunity to suddenly make an operational detour large forces. With the approach of Anglo-French forces, they would have to act against an equal enemy head-on. The success of this first strike was therefore to be decided within a tactical framework. It was not prepared by the operational design of the offensive. Had the enemy more or less skillfully directed the operations of his troops, he could have avoided a decisive defeat in Belgium. In the event that he could not gain a foothold on the fortified line Antwerp, Liège, Mayence, it should still be considered that the enemy, preserving to a greater or lesser extent the combat effectiveness of its troops, could cross the Somme in its lower reaches, and with the help of available on its side of the large reserves to create a new defensive position. The German offensive would by then have already passed through its climax. As for Army Group A, it in connection with the task before it and the forces at its disposal would not have been able to prevent the creation of a new defensive line extending from the terminus of the Maginot Line east of Sedan to the lower reaches of the Somme. The German army would thus have found itself in roughly the same position as in 1914, after the conclusion of the fall campaign. Its only advantage in this case would be that it would have a wide bridgehead on the banks of the English Channel, so would not have been achieved neither the defeat of the enemy in Belgium, as a result of which would have been created superiority in forces necessary for a decisive victory, nor to ensure a favourable operational environment for a decisive blow. The operation envisioned by the OK would have been only a private success. If in fact in 1940, thanks to the skillful actions of Army Group, the enemy was overturned in Belgium on a wide front and the Belgian and Dutch armies were forced to surrender, then this result still cannot be called a consequence of a pre-planned operation, the outcome of which was predetermined. Better leadership of the troops in the camp of our enemies could have prevented such an outcome. Said the complete defeat of the enemy in northern Belgium should be explained, obviously by the fact that due to the subsequent change in the operational plan of the enemy forces fighting in Belgium, as a result of the actions of tank formations of Army Group were cut off from their rear bases and pushed away from the Somme. Finally, the operational plan OK overlooked another circumstance. The operational capabilities that the command of the enemy forces could possess under the condition of bold and decisive action on his part. That the enemy is not capable of such actions, it was impossible to assume, because General Gamelin enjoyed a good reputation with us. At any rate, he made an excellent impression on General Beck, who visited him before the war began. Subject to courageous action, the enemy command would have the opportunity to repel the expected blow to the German forces through Belgium, and in turn to move large forces in a counter-offensive against the southern flank of the German forces operating on the northern flank, even if it transferred to Belgium forces that were intended to strengthen the Belgian and Dutch armies. It could, weakening the garrison of the Maginot Line, which was quite possible, to concentrate for such a counterattack at least 50-60 divisions. The further during this time Army Group B would move westward to the English Channel and the mouth of the Somme. The more effective would be the blow delivered by the enemy on the deep flank of the German forces operating on the northern flank. Whether Army Group with its 22 divisions would be able to repel this blow, it was unclear. Consequently, such a development of operations could hardly create a favourable operational environment for the final victory in the Western Theatre of Operations. The plan of the headquarters of Army Group. The considerations described above, which arose in my study of the directives of the OKXV, were the basis of the proposals that we made in our repeated appeals to the OKXFs, hoping to convince him of the correctness of our operational plans. Naturally, much in them was repeated. Therefore, I will summarize them here, contrasting them at the same time with the operational plans of OKXFs. 1. The goal of the offensive in the West was to win a decisive victory on land. The desire to achieve a private victory, underlying the directives of the OK, was not justified politically or militarily. The striking power of the German army on the continent is ultimately the decisive factor for us. Spending it to achieve private goals is unacceptable, if we take into account at least such a factor as the Soviet Union. 2. The main blow in our offensive operation should be delivered by Army Group A, not Army Group B. If the blow as planned, Army Group B, it would have met the enemy prepared for it, on which it would have to attack frontally. Such action would have led initially to success, but could have been stopped at the Somme. genuine chances Army Group A had provided a sudden strike through the Ardennes in the direction of the lower reaches of the Somme, in order to cut off the enemy forces transferred to Belgium from the Somme from the north. Only in this way it was possible to eliminate the entire northern flank of the enemy in Belgium, which was a prerequisite for the final victory in France. 3. However, in the actions of Army Group A is not only the main chance, but also the main danger to the German offensive. If the enemy will act correctly, he will try to avoid an unfavorable for him the outcome of the battle in Belgium, withdrawing behind the Somme. At the same time, he can throw all available forces at his disposal to counterattack on a broad front against our southern flank, in order to encircle the main forces of the German army in Belgium or south of the Lower Rhine. Although the French command could not be expected to make such a bold decision and France's allies would probably object to it, still such an option could not be ignored. At least the enemy, in case he could stop our offensive through northern Belgium on the Somme, in its lower reaches, would be able with the help of reserves again to create a continuous front. It could begin at the northwestern limit of the Maginot Line and pass east of Sedan, then along the course of the Aisne and the Somme to the English Channel. To prevent this, it was necessary to break the enemy forces concentrated against our southern flank, approximately in the area south and north of the river Meaz or between the rivers Meaz and Oise. It was necessary, first of all, to break the front in this area to be able to carry out later bypass the Maginot Line. 4. Army Group A, which was to strike the main blow in this operation, was to get instead of 2 armies 3, although for reasons of front width in the composition of Army Group B could operate more divisions. 1 army was supposed, as planned, to strike first through southern Belgium and the Meuse, then move in the direction of the lower reaches of the Somme to reach the rear of the enemy operating in front of Army Group. Another army was to operate in a southwestern direction with the task of striking at the enemy forces in the event of their concentration for a counter-offensive on our southern flank in the area west of the Maras River. The third army, as planned, was to the north of the Maginot Line in the area Cirque, zone to provide a deep flank of the entire operation. In connection with the transfer of the direction of the main blow, which was now to be applied not Army Group B and Army Group A, it was necessary to include in the latter another army, which due to the insufficient width of the offensive front was to enter the breakthrough but from the beginning should be at its disposal, and large tank formations. This was in general terms the content of the plan, which was repeated many times in our numerous appeals to the Oak. The struggle for the plan of Army Group A. Naturally then, in October 1939, I did not yet have a ready-made operational plan. In order for a mortal to achieve a goal, he must always labour and struggle. His head cannot create at once a finished work of art, just as the head of Zeus produced Athena Pallada. Nevertheless, already the first appeal of the headquarters of the Army Group Oak, containing proposals for the plan of operation in the event of a decision to attack, contained the basic provisions of the new plan. To be more precise, 2 letters were sent. In the first, sent by the commander of the Army Group to the commander of the ground forces, posed a fundamental question about the offensive in this situation. At the beginning of it, the commander stated that the offensive planned in accordance with the directives of October 19 and 29 could not have a decisive success for the outcome of the war. Distribution of forces, compared to the distribution of enemy forces, does not guarantee the final defeat of his troops. The decision to conduct a frontal operation does not give the opportunity to strike in the flank and rear of the enemy. The operation will obviously end with a frontal battle on the Somme. Further, the commander pointed out the difficulties that stand in the way of the effective use of tanks and aircraft, our main trump cards, in the late fall and winter. Despite this, the offensive should be carried out if its success would set the stage for naval and air action against the British Isles. According to the experience of the First World War, the capture of part of the Channel coast will not be sufficient for this purpose. For this purpose, it is necessary to seize the entire coast of northern France to the Atlantic Ocean. To waste the forces of the army on a private success, taking into account such a factor in our rear, such as the Soviet Union, is unacceptable. On the continent, the striking power of our army is the decisive factor. Soviet Union will maintain friendly relations with us only as long as we have an army ready for an offensive. Its striking power so far lies solely in the cadre divisions, since the newly formed units have not yet reached the necessary degree of training and the necessary internal coherence. With only cadre divisions cannot carry out an offensive, setting itself the task to win a decisive victory. It is possible, however, that as a result of the intensification of the air war with England, the Western powers themselves will launch an offensive. Whether the morale of the French army will be sufficient in the event that a result of the pressure of England will be undertaken an offensive with its great loss of life, it is not yet known. It is desirable to give the enemy the full brunt of the offensive on the fortified strip and the responsibility of violating the neutrality of Belgium. It is true that we cannot wait indefinitely for England to fill the gaps in the training of its land army and aviation. From a military point of view, the war with England can be won only at sea and in the air. On the continent it can only be lost if we expend the striking power of our army without achieving a decisive victory. The letter, therefore, was intended to warn against a premature German offensive. In this regard, the OK was of the same opinion with the Army Group headquarters. Different was the case with the plan of the planned German offensive. In this regard, the commander of the Army Group expressed his opposition to conducting such an offensive, which was provided for in the directives, that is, without the task of gaining the final victory. The second letter, sent to the OK by the Army Group headquarters on October 31, supplemented the judgments expressed by the Army Group commander with a constructive proposal as to how, in our opinion, the offensive should be conducted. This proposal already contains the basic ideas of the new plan, although not yet in finished form. It emphasizes the necessity of 1. Transferring the direction of the main blow to our southern flank. 2. The use of large mechanized forces in such a way that they came, striking from the south, in the rear of the Allied troops in northern Belgium. 3. Inclusion in the composition of Army Group of one more army, which should fall to the share of counterattack in the event of a counterattack of large enemy forces against our southern front. The results of the consideration of these proposals in connection with the forthcoming November 3 visit to the Army Group headquarters by the commander of the ground forces and the chief of the General Staff could hardly be expected. This visit, however, enabled me, on behalf of Colonel General von Rundstedt, to report our considerations. Our request for additional forces, however, was refused by Colonel General von Brochich, who said, "Yes, if I had enough forces for that." This showed that he was not at that time categorically opposed to our plans. At any rate, he promised us from the reserves of the OKA Tank Division and 2 motorized infantry regiments. Unfortunately, this visit at the same time made it clear to us that the leading figures of the OK, the planned offensive and especially the possibility of a decisive victory in the West, with strong prejudice. They naturally received information from army commanders and corps commanders about the condition of their formation, but in fact the way they took for granted the numerous gaps in the training of the newly formed divisions led to the conclusion that they themselves did not expect much from the planned offensive. In order to alleviate this impression, a few days later Colonel General von Rundstedt gathered the generals of the Army Group and, outlining the operational plan of the headquarters of the Army Group, showed that in the West it is quite possible to achieve a decisive success, although the offensive is advisable to carry out only in the spring. On November 6, we used the response to the request of the OK regarding our plans within the limits of the directives given to us to once again petition for the adoption of the above proposals, but without success. Meanwhile, Hitler's weather forecasters, the meteorologists of the Air Ministry, were climbing briskly up and down their ladders. As a result, it was enough for them to predict at least for a short period of good weather, as Hitler gave the order to move to the initial areas of the offensive. But each time his weather forecasters refused their predictions and had to give the rebuff. On November 12, we received the following telegram quite unexpectedly. The Führer gave the order, on the southern flank of the 12th Army, or in the offensive zone of the 16th Army, to introduce a third group of mobile troops with the task of striking across the open countryside on both sides of Arlon, Tingtigny and Florenville in the direction of Sedan and east of it. The composition of the group, the headquarters of the 19 AC, 2 and 10 TD, 1 motorized infantry division, the Life Standard, the Regiment Great Germany. This group has the following tasks: to smash the enemy's mobile forces transferred to southern Belgium and thus facilitate the 12th and 16th Armies to fulfill their tasks. In the area of Sedan, or southeast of it, to suddenly cross the Meuse and thus create favourable conditions for the continuation of operations, especially in the event that the armoured formations operating in the 6 and 4 Armies cannot be used. This was followed by a special supplement to the OKH directive. The text of the telegram implied that the transfer of 19 AC in the Army Group E was made on the orders of Hitler. How did he come to this idea? It is possible that Hitler was led to this idea by a report of the commander of the 16th Army, Colonel General Busch, who had visited him shortly before. General Busch was privy to my thoughts. Probably he had mentioned during his report to Hitler our desire for armoured formations for a quick breakthrough through the Ardennes. Maybe Hitler himself came to this thought. He had an ability to understand tactical possibilities and sat over maps a lot. He could see that the easiest way to force the Meuse at Sedan, while further armoured formations of the Fourth Army will encounter much greater difficulties. Perhaps he realised that the crossing of the Meuse at Sedan would create a convenient bridgehead, and wanted, as always, to pursue all the tempting goals at once. In practice, however, no matter how happy we were to receive a tank corps, it meant the fragmentation of the forces of our armoured formations. The commander of the 19th Panzer Corps, General Guderian, so at first did not agree with this new plan for the use of his corps. After all, he has always defended the view that tanks should be clustered in one place. Only after I introduced him to the operational plan of Army Group and our desire to move the direction of the main blow of the entire operation on the southern flank, in the area of operations of Army Group A, when he saw the tempting goal of access to the mouth of the Somme in the rear of the enemy, he became the most ardent advocate of this plan. His energy inspired later our armoured forces, which made a raid behind enemy lines as far as the Channel coast. For me, of course, was a great relief that my idea of a breakthrough by large forces of tanks through the Ardennes, despite the difficulties associated with overcoming inaccessible terrain, considered Guderian as quite realistic. As for, however, the transfer to the Army Group 19 Tank Corps, then, according to Hitler's plan, it pursued, of course, only a tactical goal, the achievement of which should facilitate the forcing of the Mile as and for Army Group. And in the addendum to the directive sent by the OK nowhere mentioned a change in the overall plan. I mean the plan to win a decisive victory by covering the enemy forces of Army Group A in the direction of the mouth of the Somme, or actions aimed at least at its preparation. November 21. We were again visited by the commander of ground forces with the chief of the General Staff. For the meeting in Koblenz were summoned, in addition to the commanders of the armies of Army Group A, also the commander of Army Group B, Colonel General von Beck and his army commanders. Serising is important because of the following circumstance. Colonel General von Brechech wished to hear from the Army Group commanders and Army commanders present their considerations, as well as orders for the implementation of the OK directive. When, however, after the commander of Army Group B and his army commanders, the turn came to us, Brechech stated that it was enough for him to listen to the army commanders. Obviously, he wanted to prevent the possibility of the commander of the group of armies to present their views contrary to the directive. We had no choice but to once again convey to the leaders of the OK our thoughts on how the offensive should be organized, in writing, in a pre-drafted memo. In it were set out, as in the two previous letters dated October 31 and November 6, and in the four subsequent ones, dated November 30, December 6, December 18 and January 12, already mentioned before, the basic provisions on which was based the plan of the headquarters of the Troop of Armies on the organization of the operation as a whole. These provisions were modified in separate notes and justified by various arguments connected with the situation at that moment. Since, however, in principle it was about the same operational plans and proposals which have already been outlined, I will refuse to repeat. At this time, Hitler was apparently considering the question of the use of the 19th Panzer Corps as part of Army Group, as well as whether to enter the breakthrough followed by other forces, and how it should be done in the event that the impact of large tank forces operating as part of Army Group B will not lead to the expected rapid success. In any case, as writes Greiner, responsible for keeping the combat log of the OP, in mid-November, Hitler asked the OK whether to strengthen the tank corps Guderian and what forces can be allocated for this purpose. According to Greiner, around November 20, Hitler instructed that the OK should take measures, if necessary, to shift the direction of the main strike from the area of Army Group B's operations to the area of Army Group A's operations, if there are more rapid and significant success than that of Army Group B is indicated. Apparently, to fulfill this instruction, Oak in late November moved the 14 Corps, which was on the east bank of the Rhine, behind the deployment area of Army Group A. However, it continued to remain in the reserve of the OK, and it was stipulated that, depending on the situation, it would operate either as part of Army Group B or as part of Army Group A. It remains unclear whether Hitler himself came to the idea of the possibility of a major strike by Army Group A, or by this time he had already learned something about the plans of our headquarters of the Army Group. One day after the previously mentioned speech, which Hitler made on November 23 in Berlin before the commanders of the associations of the three branches of the armed forces, he received Colonel General von Rundstedt with Generals Busch and Guderian. During this reception, Hitler, as Busch told me on the return trip to Koblenz, showed great interest in Army Group considerations. If this is indeed true, it was obviously primarily a question of strengthening the armoured forces that make up the Army Group, in order to fulfill the task set by Hitler, to break through the defences on the boundary of the Maas River at Sedan to support the actions of Army Group B. That Colonel General von Rundstedt reported to Hitler our plan of operations, which differs from the plan contained in the Directive Oak, I consider impossible, given the precarious positions held at that time, the commander of the ground forces. Besides, he would have informed me of it. As for Greiner's words that Hitler had already learned of the Army Group headquarters plan from his adjutant Schmundt at the end of October, this seems to me doubtful, at least as to the date. Schmundt, it is true, was with us on Hitler's instructions for the purpose of verifying reports that weather conditions and terrain did not permit the launching of an offensive. During his visit, our Chief of Operations, Colonel Blumentritt, and Lieutenant Colonel von Tresco informally informed Schmundt that Army Group headquarters had submitted, in their opinion, the best offensive plan in the OK. Blumentritt then, a few days later, with my consent, sent a copy of the last memo I had drawn up to Colonel Schmundt. Whether the latter showed it to Hitler, or at least to General Jodl, I do not know. In any case, Hitler on February 17, 1940, during my presentation, at his request, considerations on how the offensive should be organized in the West. Not a word did not make it clear that he was familiar with one of the memos sent by us to the... I admit that Hitler, in late November, Hitler wanted to reserve the possibility of shifting the direction of the main blow from the area of Army Group B, in the area of Army Group A already in the course of the operation. However, this in no way meant a departure from the previous operational plan or the adoption of the main provisions of the plan of the headquarters of Army Group. Despite the transfer of the 14th Corps as a reserve oak behind the deployment area of our Army Group, the previous directive remained in full force. Success was still to be achieved primarily by the main forces of Army Group B in northern Belgium, while Army Group A was still to cover the advancing troops. So only if it turned out that the actions of Army Group B did not justify the hopes placed on them, or if in the area of Army Group A would soon indicate success, Hitler wanted to be able to shift the direction of the main blow. This was also clear from the reply I received from General Golda to our regular memo regarding the operational plan of November 3rd. It said that it was now planned to choose another direction of the main strike, namely in the area of operations of Army Group, which in the event of a successful breakthrough through the Ardennes will inevitably lead to our proposed expansion of the purpose of the operation and the conduct of the entire operation in the spirit of our proposals. The answer of General Golda said that most of our considerations coincide with the intentions of the... There was a difference between them, which consisted in the fact that the orders issued by the OK so far have not led to the formation of a new direction of the main strike, but only gave the possibility of creating such a direction. The reply went on to say, the establishment of a direction of main attack as a result of forces outside our sphere of influence has in reality been transformed from a matter of strategic deployment into a matter of directing the operation during its execution. Two conclusions could be drawn from this reply. The first was that Hitler reserved to himself the right to make the most important decisions, and during the offensive itself. The second was that he wanted to make the choice of the direction of the main strike dependent on the course of the offensive itself. More importantly, however, was that he did not know or did not want to accept the plan of operation proposed by the headquarters of the Army Group. The latter impression was strengthened after a telephone conversation with General Halder on December 15. On December 6, I once again wrote a personal letter to the Chief of the General Staff, in which I again cited all the considerations that spoke in favor of our operational plan. In this letter, the new plan was set forth already in the form of a completed proposal for the operation, When I did not receive a reply from General Galder by December 15, I telephoned General von Stelpnagel, Chief of the First Office, and asked him whether the OK would continue to remain silent on our proposals. This was followed by a telephone call from Galder, whom I mentioned above. He assured me that it is true that they quite share our point of view, but have strict orders to leave in force the instruction to strike the main blow with the forces of Army Group B, otherwise leave the matter open until the designation of success in the course of the operation. Accordingly, it could be considered that the OKH really accepted our operational proposals, and in some form, in his own name, reported them to Hitler. At the same time, however, General Warlimont, Jodel's representative, and the first Deputy Chief of Staff of the Operational Command of the Armed Forces, the future General von Lossberg, informed me that the OK had never approached Hitler in the spirit of our proposals. This situation seemed to us very strange. In reality, or only in words, the OK shared our point of view, but in any case, the idea of deciding to make the decision to strike a major blow by the forces of Army Group, or only during the offensive, could not be identified in any way with our operation. Non-Singage part out at Envoit, and this saying became almost an axiom for the French, especially after they failed so badly with their offensive in Lorraine. This axiom in 1940 could certainly be applied to the actions of the Allied command, which wanted to force us to advance and would have been quite right to wait for this offensive. It had to avoid a decisive battle in Belgium so that then large forces to strike back at the southern flank of our advancing group. For us to postpone the moment when we put into play our trump cards and delaying the decision on where it will happen were unacceptable, because the operational plan of the headquarters of the Army Group was based on the suddenness of the strike, a strike by a large force of tanks through the forested Ardennes, which was to be followed by the army, could hardly be expected by the enemy. This strike, however, could lead us to the goal of the operation, the lower reaches of the Somme, only if it was possible to break the enemy forces that could be transferred to southern Belgium. At the same time, with the remnants of these defeated forces, we had to cross the Meuse, to then go to the rear of the enemy armies located in northern Belgium against the front of Army Group. Similarly, the attempt to strike at the large enemy reserves on our southern flank, in the area between the Maas and the Oise before they have time to concentrate, and thus create a favourable situation for a second strike, pursuing the goal of destroying the rest of the enemy force, could succeed only if we had numerical superiority here. To wait in order to decide later on the choice of the direction of the main strike, to look where the hare runs, would mean nothing else than to give up the chance to give the enemy a decisive blow in northern Belgium by bypassing him from the south. It would have meant at the same time that the enemy was given the opportunity to deploy his large reserves for such a counterattack on our southern flank as might have brought him victory. However, the command of the enemy forces failed to seize this chance. The idea of waiting to include the necessary forces in Army Group and put the choice of the direction of the main blow depending on whether we achieve a sudden success with insufficient forces can be characterized by Moltke's words. A mistake in the plan of deployment for the first strike is irreparable. So we could not wait to see how our offensive would develop, whether the enemy forces in northern Belgium would be defeated as a result of a massive blow of Army Group B, or a lone 19 Panzer Corps will reach Sedan. It was necessary, in the event that the Army Group plan was adopted, to include in its composition from the outset enough armoured formations and 3 armies. In this regard, in a note dated December 6, I demanded for the Army Group instead of 2 armies with 22 infantry divisions and only 1 tank corps, 3 armies of about 40 divisions, as well as 2 mobile corps. The struggle of the Army Group headquarters for the operational plan defended by it, therefore, had to continue. Now it was mainly a question of the fact that from the very beginning of the operation in the group would operate not only the 19th Panzer Corps, but together with it and the 14th Corps, which would have the task to strike through the Ardennes, to force the Meuse in the area of Sedan and below it, and then to advance in the direction of the lower reaches of the Somme. Further, we fought for another army to be given to us from the outset to launch a counterattack in the event of an enemy attack on our southern flank west of the Meuse. If it had been possible to achieve both, then, regardless of whether the OKE agreed with our main plan or not, it would inevitably be a question of an offensive, the purpose of which would be the complete defeat of the enemy, which we insisted on. Of course, and our operational plan, in the words of Moltke, did not go beyond the first clash with the main forces of the enemy, but only in the event that the offensive due to lack of forces would choke on its initial phase. However, Moltke there also says that the commander should, planning the first clashes with the enemy, always have in mind his main goal. This goal, in our opinion, could only be a decisive victory on the continent. With this goal in mind, the offensive of the German army should have been organized in the event that this victory could only be won in the second phase. The above-mentioned recipe of Napoleon, which ultimately explains Hitler's cautious position in choosing the direction of the main strike in a different environment, could have been a better solution. For us, it meant giving up complete victory. Since my letter to the Chief of the General Staff on December 6 did not lead to the desired results, on December 18, I submitted to Colonel General von Rundstedt, based on our operational plan draft directive on the offensive on the Western Front. This document was to serve as a basis for him to report to the commander of the land forces, and, if approved, also to report to Hitler. On December 22, this draft was reported to Brauchitsch, but it was not reported to Hitler. In addition, a copy of the draft was sent to the OK. I hoped that the concrete form in which our operational intent was clothed in this document might perhaps make a more convincing impression than our theoretical reasoning, that perhaps the operational directorate would now agree with our plans. As I learned after the war, however, the operational directorate did not receive from General Galder our memos on the offensive in the West. In the second half of December, the state of the weather precluded any thought of an offensive. Moreover, it seemed to us advisable to pause in our efforts to bring about a change in the operational plan. We had already provided ample material for reflection. I was therefore able to spend the Christmas holidays at home. During my return from Liegnitz to Koblenz, I stopped by the OK in Zossen to hear how the attitude toward our draft operation had been during that time. General von Stelpnagel again told me that they in the OK were basically in agreement with our plans, that the OK was bound by Hitler's order that the decision on the choice of the direction of the main strike should remain open. It was still unclear whether the commander of the ground forces had even spoken to hear about our plans. This seemed unlikely, because the then head of the 1st Division of the Operations Directorate, Lieutenant Colonel Husinger, reported that Colonel General von Brauchitsch, since November 5, stopped visiting Hitler. With the beginning of the new year, Hitler's weather forecasters again revived. Heavy frost promised the onset of good weather, which would be favorable for the actions of aviation, but the cold, accompanied by heavy snowfall, resulting in the Eifel and the Ardennes covered with a thick layer of snow. Tanks are not at all favorable. Hitler, however, again gave the order to occupy the areas of the initial position. Despite this, Army Group Headquarters on 12 January again sent to the OK memo entitled Offensive in the West, which again outlined so often repeated by us the provisions on the organization of the offensive in the West, which should have as its goal to achieve a decisive victory. Although it was not possible at that moment to think of changing the directive, the headquarters still hoped that its plan would, in one way or another, come to the fore in the conduct of the operation as part of the ongoing preparations for the offensive. In addition, the order for the offensive had already been cancelled so often that we could expect it to be cancelled this time, and then again the opportunity would present itself to fundamentally change the operational plan. But if we wanted this opportunity to materialize, we had to remove the brake that had hitherto prevented the adoption of our operational plan. Where was it? According to what we have heard so far from the OK, it was Hitler's point of view. The OK repeatedly emphasized that it largely agreed with our proposals, but that it was bound by Hitler's order to choose the direction of the main strike depending on the success of operations. But did the OK report our plan to Hitler, a plan that differed so much from the offensive directive he had drawn up? Maybe, if you present Hitler a plan of operations, which pursues not only private goals, but from the very beginning creates the possibility of achieving a decisive success in the West, he could be convinced of the correctness of the latter. In order to clarify this question, a letter signed by Colonel General von Rundstedt, attached to the memo Offensive in the West, ended with the following sentence. In view of the fact that it has become known from the order of the OKB to the Army Group that the Führer and the Supreme Commander-in-Chief has reserved to himself the decision on the choice of the direction of the main blow in the conduct of the operation, and thus also the leadership of the operation, and in view of the fact that the OPB is not free in deciding operational questions, I request that this proposal be reported to the Führer. Of course, this request, with which I suggested to the Colonel General to address the OK, and which he readily agreed to affix his signature, to some extent contradicted the traditions of the German army. According to these traditions, only the commander of the ground forces, or on his behalf, the chief of the general staff, was allowed to address proposals to Hitler. However, if the OK was really in agreement with our considerations, it could always in its own name to report the plan to Hitler. In this way it might have had the opportunity to raise its weight in his eyes, and thus regain its function as the highest authority for directing the actions of the land forces. No one could have welcomed this result more than I, for in my time, while I was still Deputy Chief of the General Staff, together with Colonel General von Fritsch and General Beck, I fought so hard for the OK to occupy such a position. If the OK had already reported to Hitler its considerations, which coincided with ours, and did not achieve the result, the presentation of such an operational plan coming from Colonel General von Rundstedt, whom Hitler valued very much, would have meant considerable support for the OK. Maybe then it would still be possible to dissuade Hitler from putting the choice of the direction of the main strike in dependence on the success of operations. And this, as far as we could judge from the statements of the OK, was the main thing that stood in the way of the adoption of our operational plan. The reply we received to this memo disappointed us. It stated that our view that OK was only pursuing a private objective was incorrect. The subsequent objective will be set in a timely manner. Consideration is being given to adding additional forces to the army group, as well as another army headquarters. The timing of the transfer of these forces will be determined by the ground force commander. The final decision on the choice of the direction of the main strike will be made by Hitler on the submission of the commander of land forces. It does not seem necessary to send Hitler our aide-memoire, since the commander of land forces largely agrees with it. Although this reply stated that the commander of land forces basically agrees with our memo, it could not, however, conceal from us that he was not going to report to Hitler on a radical change in the operational plan in the spirit of our proposals. On the contrary, the previous directive remained in force. The decisive blow in Belgium was to strike frontally Army Group B. It, at least in the first phase of operations, was to act in the direction of the main blow. Army Group A was still to cover the troops involved in this operation. Its task was not expanded in terms of striking in the direction of the lower Somme. In the rear, the enemy troops attacked in northern Belgium from the front of Army Group B. Transfer of the direction of the main blow in the area of operations of Army Group A, as before, was made dependent on the flow of operations. Army Group still did not receive armoured formations, whose inclusion in its composition from the very beginning of the operation was in accordance with the plan of the Army Group, a prerequisite for achieving surprise in southern Belgium, and then strike in the rear of the enemy in the direction of the mouth of the Somme. Army Group was also not sure in strengthening it with another army, which would have been necessary to repel the blow of the enemy went on the counter-offensive. Thus, the error in the plan of deployment for the first strike, which Smolt considered irreparable, was not eliminated. They did not want to dare to take a step that, in the words of General Jodl, said by him in February 1940, represents a smuggling operation in which you risk being captured by the god of war. So apparently, the command of the German army, as well as the Allied command, without realizing it, came to the general conclusion that it is safer to act against each other frontally in northern Belgium than to take the risk of a bold operation on the German in case of acceptance of the plan of the headquarters of Army Group A, on the part of the Allies in case of evasion of the decisive battle in Belgium and a powerful counterattack on the southern flank of the advancing German troops. Meanwhile, there was an event that many later began to attach decisive importance to the subsequent radical change in the plan of operation in the spirit of the proposals of our group of armies. Chief of Operations of the 7th Air Division headquarters mistakenly landed on Belgian territory. In this case, the Belgians got into the hands of the Belgians at least excerpts from the plan for the use of the 1st Air Fleet during the operation. It was therefore to be assumed that the Western powers would be informed by Belgium of the existing operational plan. In reality, however, this incident did not lead to a change in the operational plan, although it may be thought that it later contributed to the acceptance by Hitler and the OK of the Army Group's proposal. A meeting held by the commander of the ground forces with the commanders of Army Groups A and B, and the commanders of their subordinate armies, held at Koblenz and at Badisburg on January 25, also showed that the basic provisions of the OK plan remained. This meeting was held much later than the incident mentioned above. The tasks of Army Groups A and B remained unchanged. Was only slightly expanded the task of Army Group B, whose 18th Army was now to capture the entire territory of Holland, for Army Group A all remained unchanged. True, the headquarters of the Second Army was transferred to the area of operations of our group of armies, however, and he, as well as the 14th Corps, remained in the reserve division. As for the latter, this decision remained in force, despite my report, which I made on behalf of the commander of the Army Group, that the strike through the Ardennes by the forces of 119th Panzer Corps is a half-hearted measure. It does not promise success at Sedan, as the enemy in the meantime concentrated on the Meuse large force. Despite these remarks, Colonel General von Brauchage stated that he could not transfer the 14th Corps to us. This was an indication that the command of the German army still insisted on putting the question of shifting the direction of the main blow in the area of action of Army Group, depending on the progress of the operation. This proves, however, and the fact that the incident in the hands of the Belgian plans of operation did not prompt the command to change the existing plan of attack. Nevertheless, the Army Group headquarters sent another memo to the OK on January 30, supplementing the considerations I expressed on January 25 to the commander of the ground forces, based on the information received in the meantime about the enemy. Headquarters pointed out that we must now reckon with the possibility of moving to southern Belgium, large enemy forces, particularly mobile formations. Under these circumstances, we cannot count on the fact that the 19th Panzer Corps alone will be able to repel the blow they have inflicted. It will not be able to force the river alone. Sein's opinion was confirmed at the manoeuvres that took place on February 7 in Koblenz, during which tested the readiness for the offensive 19th Key and both armies that were part of our group of armies. The manoeuvres showed how problematic is the offensive of the isolated 19th Key. I had the impression that General Halder, who was present at the manoeuvres, finally began to understand the correctness of our plan. At this time, however, in my life suddenly changed. On January 27, I received word that I was appointed commander of the 38 AC, which was soon to be formed in the rear. As Colonel General von Rundstedt told me, the commander of the land forces had previously informed him of the change of his chief of staff on January 25 at the above-mentioned meeting. He explained this by saying that I could no longer be bypassed in the appointment of new corps commanders, since General Regenterli, who had less seniority in his rank, was also receiving a corps. Although my appointment could in no way be regarded as a violation of the usual order of appointment to posts, at a time when a great offensive was imminent, such a change of chiefs of staff looked very strange. As the question of seniority, which was the pretext for it, could have been settled otherwise. Therefore, it can hardly be doubted that my resignation from the post of Chief of Staff of the Army Group was due to the desire of the OK to get rid of annoying him persistent man who dared to oppose his operational plan another plan. After the above-mentioned military manoeuvres, in the leadership of which I was still involved, Colonel General von Rundstedt expressed to me in the presence of all the participants of the exercises, thanked me for my work as Chief of Staff of the Army Group. All the noble magnanimity of this military commander was expressed in these words. It was also a great satisfaction to me that the commanders of the armies that were part of our group, Generals Bosch and List, as well as General Guderian, not only expressed regret at my resignation, but also expressed their sincere grief. On February 9, I left Koblenz and went first to Liegnitz. Meanwhile, my faithful aides, Colonel Blumentritt and Lieutenant Colonel von Tresco, were not going to lay down their arms and did not think that with my resignation the struggle for our operational plan should be considered over. I think that none other than Tresco induced his friend Schmundt, Hitler's chief adjutant, to find an opportunity for us ourselves to report to Hitler our thoughts on the plan for organizing the offensive. In any case, on February 17, I was summoned along with all the other newly appointed commanders in Berlin for presentation to Hitler. After we introduced ourselves, a breakfast was given, during which, as usual, Hitler mainly spoke. I remember he showed an astonishing knowledge of the novelties in the field of military technology, as well as the armies of the enemy. The report of an attack by a British destroyer on the steamer Altmark in Norwegian territorial waters was used by Hitler for a long discourse on the fact that small states are unable to maintain neutrality. When we began to say goodbye to Hitler after breakfast, he invited me into his office. There, he invited me to present my point of view on the organization of the offensive in the West, whether he already knew from his chief adjutant about our plan, and to what extent he was informed in this case, I cannot say. In any case, I could only marvel at the remarkable speed with which he had understood the point of view which the army group had been defending for months. In any case, he quite approved of my ideas. After this conversation, I immediately from memory compiled a note to the army group headquarters, the text of which I want to quote. Former Chief of Staff of Army Group, during his presentation in connection with his appointment to the post of Commander of the 38th AC on February 17, 1940, had the opportunity to report to the Führer considerations of Army Group regarding the organization of the offensive in the West. The following considerations were reported. 1. The task of the offensive in the West should be the final victory on land, in order to achieve private goals as they are formulated in the existing offensive directive. For example, the defeat of large enemy forces in Belgium, the capture of part of the Channel coast. It is politically and militarily inexpedient to use the armed forces. The task is to win the final victory on the continent. In organizing the offensive, therefore, from the very beginning it is necessary to aim the troops at a decisive victory in France, to break the strength of resistance of the French army. 2. For this purpose, it is necessary that, contrary to the directive, the main blow is struck from the beginning on the southern flank of Army Group A, and not Army Group B, and also that the question of it is not left open. Under the existing plan can only at best frontal strike at the Anglo-French forces moving there and push them back to the Somme, where the offensive could be stopped. As a result of the fact that now the main blow will be delivered by Army Group acting on the southern flank, which has the task of advancing through southern Belgium and the Meuse River in the direction of the lower reaches of the Somme, large enemy forces located in northern Belgium, after they will be thrown back by the frontal strike of Army Group B, will be cut off and destroyed. This will be possible only if Army Group A quickly strikes in the direction of the lower reaches of the Somme. This is the first part of the campaign. It will be followed by the second part, the coverage of the French army large forces operating on the right flank. 3. This task of Army Group A requires the inclusion of 3 armies. Thus it is necessary to deploy another army on the northern flank. 2 Army, located on the northern flank of Army Group, has the task, forcing the Meuse, to strike in the direction of the lower reaches of the Somme, cutting off the enemy forces thrown back by the strike of Army Group B. South of her, another army should force the Meuse on both sides of Sedan, then turn to the southwest, and by counter-attacking to repel the attempts of the French army large forces to go on the counter-offensive west of the Meuse and break them. The Third Army will first have to cover participating in the offensive forces on their southern flank, between the Meuse and Moselle. Of great importance is to strike airstrikes on the enemy armies deployed to go on the counter-offensive, as the French may risk throwing in this offensive large forces on the front west of the Meuse or on both sides of it, possibly up to the Moselle. 4. Strike 119 TK in the direction of the Meuse at Sedan is a half measure. If the enemy comes to meet us in southern Belgium with large forces of mechanized troops, the forces of the corps are not enough to quickly break them, and on the shoulders of the remnants of the defeated troops to force the Meuse. If the enemy is limited to holding the boundary of the river Meuse large forces, as can be judged by the grouping of its forces at present, the corps alone will not be able to force them up. If we decide to throw forward mechanized formations, then for this purpose in the offensive zone of the Army Group must be concentrated at least 2 corps, which must cross the Meuse simultaneously at Charleville and Sedan, regardless of the offensive of tanks in the direction of the Meuse at Givet by the forces of the Fourth Army. Consequently, the 14 corps from the beginning should operate alongside the Corps Guderian, and the decision on its subordination to Army Group A or B cannot be left open. The Führer expressed his agreement with these considerations. A short time later, a new offensive directive was issued. This final directive on the offensive, unfortunately, I have not seen. I only know that it was drawn up on Hitler's instructions on February 20. In outline, it contained the following provisions, which met the demands so long advocated to us. 1. Striking 2 tank corps in the direction of the Meuse between Charleville and Sedan and forcing the Meuse in this area. 2. The final subordination of the headquarters of the Second Army to Army Group A and the transfer to him the forces necessary for the formation of another army. Thus, it was ensured the immediate introduction of it into the breakthrough, as soon as it will allow the width of the offensive band of the Army Group as a result of the turn of the 16th Army to the south. 3. Subordination of the 4th Army to Army Group A, in order to create for it the possibility of maneuver in the direction of the lower reaches of the Somme. News directive of the OK, thus fully met the considerations advocated by the headquarters of the Army Group. In the direction of the main blow of the entire operation was shifted to the southern flank, and used the full width of the front of the area located north of the Maginot Line and the existing network of roads in it. Despite this, Army Group B with its 3 armies remained strong enough to successfully fulfill its task in northern Belgium and Holland. Army Group A now had the opportunity to strike a sudden blow to the enemy through the Ardennes and the Meuse in the direction of the lower reaches of the Somme. Thanks to this, it could cut off the enemy forces operating in northern Belgium, the ways of withdrawal across the river. It also became possible to make a successful counterattack on the enemy troops in the event that they would go large forces in a counter-offensive against our southern flank. As for the implementation of the offensive operation of the German army in May 1940, I would like to note the following. The offensive of Army Group B had, due to the superiority of German troops, especially armoured formations, greater results than could be expected with the inevitable frontal nature of the offensive and the need to overcome the powerful fortifications on the Belgian border. Nevertheless, of decisive importance for the complete defeat of the Allied forces in northern Belgium was a blow suddenly struck through the Ardennes and the Meuse in the direction of the mouth of the Somme, and finally on the ports in the English Channel, along with the energetic leadership of the troops on the part of Colonel General von Rundstedt, who sought to implement this plan. This success should perhaps be attributed primarily to the indomitable will with which General Guderian carried out the operational plan of the Army Group. Victory in northern Belgium was not as complete as it might have been. According to the data cited by Churchill, the enemy managed to cross Dunkirk 338,226 people, although he lost all their heavy weapons and other equipment. This is explained by the intervention of Hitler, twice delayed the advancing tank formation. The first time during their advance to the coast, the second time before Doug. 3 reasons are given to justify the latter order, which built the British Army a golden bridge across the English Channel. First, Hitler supposedly wanted to give the tanks a rest before the second phase of the campaign in France, due to the fact that Keitel informed him that the area around Dunkirk tank-accessible terrain. Another reason is that Goering allegedly guaranteed the Führer that the Air Force itself will be able to prevent the British from evacuating from Dunkirk. Given Goering's desire to raise his prestige and his love of boasting, I think such a statement on his part is quite possible. Be that as it may, both of these arguments were untenable from a military point of view. As a third reason is given the argument that Hitler, as he allegedly stated in a conversation with Colonel General von Rundstedt, deliberately let the British evacuate, because he believed that this would bring closer the opportunity to negotiate with them. In any case, the fact that the British Army was given the opportunity to evacuate from Dunkirk is a crucial mistake Hitler. It prevented him from later deciding to invade England and then allowed the British to continue the war in Africa and Italy. Hitler, it is true, accepted the plan of Army Group A, which allowed by striking through the Ardennes to the sea to cut off enemy forces in northern Belgium and let it be realized, at least until the gates of Dunkirk. However, he did not fully adopt the second part of it, aimed at simultaneously creating the prerequisites for the transition to the second phase of operations. The German command was limited to the fact that provided cover for mobile formations, striking on the coast, from the expected counterattack of the enemy on both sides of the river Meuse, by echeloning the divisions following them along the exposed southern flank, with the task of repelling enemy strikes. The plan to launch an offensive west of the Meuse to the south, in order to defeat the enemy in case he attempts a major counter-offensive, and thus finally break the enemy front between the Meuse and the Oise, obviously seemed too risky. As it was revealed later, during the campaign in Russia, Hitler had some instinct in dealing with operational issues. However, he lacked the experience of a military commander, which allows him to take even great risks during an operation because he knows what he is going for. So this time Hitler preferred the worst, defensive option to cover the southern flank of the troops involved in the first phase of the offensive, a bolder solution proposed by the Army Group. He was lucky, because the enemy command did not dare to counterattack with large forces. It could well in time to concentrate about 50 divisions for a counter-offensive on a broad front on both sides of the Maas, and under favourable conditions, east to the Moselle, if necessary, temporarily sacrificing the territory of Holland and Belgium, except for the fortresses. It so happened that after the end of the first phase of the German offensive, the two enemies again confronted each other on a continuous front along the Maginot Line to Carignan and further along the Aisne and the Lower Somme. The Germans now had to break through this front again. If the second phase of the offensive of the German army in such a short time led to the complete surrender of the enemy, it was only because he was unable to occupy sufficient forces to defend on a continuous front from the Swiss border to the sea, having suffered such heavy losses in northern Belgium. The second reason was that the morale of the French army had already been dealt a decisive blow. Needless to say, the enemy did not have troops equivalent to the German operational tank formations. If the commander of the Allied forces acted as envisioned by the headquarters of Group A, he would have deployed an offensive by large forces on both sides of the River Maas. According to the plan of the Army Group, however, the enemy forces in this case would be broken even on the approach between the Maas and the Oise. If we had simultaneously surrounded the enemy forces in northern Belgium, and then Army Group would strike across the Lower Somme to encircle the remnants of the French forces in the spirit of the Schlieffen Plan, we would eventually come to the rear of the Maginot Line and would fight with inverted fronts. Since we, with the exception of the evacuation of British troops through Dunkirk, won a complete victory in the French theatre of operations, the above may seem superfluous. I have dwelt on these considerations because it may be useful to show that even with more energetic and correct enemy action, the new plan could have led to victory, even if in doing so critical moments were sometimes created in the first phase between the Meuse and the Moselle.